The landscape has changed in different ways. The barriers are very different. Barriers are to some extent less, but the onus of governance is slightly different.
Hey there, and welcome to the Video Learning Lab podcast. My name is Kevin Alster, and today I'm excited to bring you another conversation about AI's impact on the learning and development function. Today's conversation is with Dr. Ashwin Mehta, or just Ash, who's a digital learning leader in healthcare for over 15 years. And I reached out to him because I think he actually has the systems background to talk about how to design effective AI-enabled learning for enterprise. And in particular, I want you to focus on the beginning of the conversation where we talk about L&D's relationship with content creation and how maybe having AI enabled processes and tools isn't necessarily the solution, where we don't just want to make content faster, because we've known for a decade at least that more content is not serving our employees or the businesses that we serve. And so listen to the conversation today, listen to how Ash talks about what's needed from the L&D function in terms of being able to create useful AI-enabled experiences, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you. Interesting. It makes me think of where we were maybe a year ago when L&D heard about generative AI and was like, oh, we'll have these platforms that generate these learning pathways for us and can sequence content for us. But as far as I know, there isn't a largely adopted or even existing enterprise level solution, or even just a consumer level solution for building and serving up content in the way that we had imagined. And so, yes, a lot of the conversation is about optimizing processes. And I'm curious if, in your world, if there's been anybody who seems like they're a step closer to an end-to-end solution, or are we still in the ideation, experimentation phase at this point?
Yeah, I think we're still in the ideation and experimentation phase, and there are a couple of artifacts that lead us to that. So one is because this has been disruptive for the last 2 years, the market itself is full of solutions that do discrete things. So one solution does this, another solution does that. And the barrier to entry into this space is now a lot lower than it used to be. So you can go and make something with a lot less pain than it used to be. And that means that the market is full of solutions. So you can go and choose solutions, but none of them are going to really be an end to end because they're all doing something discrete. They're filling a particular niche or a particular void. And most of them are very good solutions, but they do this thing or this other thing. And usually in an enterprise big company or even a small company, if you want to examine an end to end, workflow or process or something like that, then the chances are there's not really an off the shelf solution that will give you that. It's going to require either an off the shelf solution to be heavily customized, or it's going to require something that needs to be built in a bespoke way for that particular application. And because the market is like that, what I'm talking about and what you're talking about is having something that's end to end optimized that uses the best technology that we have access to. We're too early in the life cycle, I think, for anybody to really have developed something end to end that it isn't still in testing or still in pilot. So we're very early in this space, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I think then if we look at where folks currently are, where maybe they've adopted a few AI tools, and mostly around content creation into their tech stack and are using them now. I'm curious. There's plenty of other people who are still exploring what these tools can do, what they think that they can do, and I know that you've worked in a lot of different organizations and contexts about this process of how you figure out what integrates into your tech stack. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to AI, that's when people start talking about data and
Mm.
pathways and experience and all these different directions it can go. But I know that you take you take a change management or a consulting approach rather. Can you walk us through kind of what is your process for how, if a company is to approach you with a particular problem,
Yeah.
how do you go about enabling an AI solution, assuming that AI is part of that solution?
So the first thing, and let's just put tech aside for a second, because advanced technology could be traditional AI, so machine learning, neural networks, pattern recognition style uh, technology, or it could be the newer stuff, generative AI, where we're looking at conversational outputs, multimedia outputs, uh, synthetic media, effectively. But we could also be talking about digital twins, blockchain. We could be talking about simulations. We could be talking about the Internet of Things and smart sensors and so many different things that when you have that initial conversation, we should probably just put tech aside for a second and just think about what is the thing that we're trying to achieve? What's the purpose? What's the outcome that we want that makes our business better or faster or more cost effective or secures a niche in the market or secures competitive advantage? What is the thing that we're trying to do? And for some businesses, it may well be, the economy globally is in a particular state. We want to achieve cost efficiency. We want to reduce budgets. We want to achieve scale across geographies. Maybe translation or localization is a thing that we want to be able to do effectively and efficiently. We might want to be thinking about process or automation or optimization. And uh, and these are things that are fairly common across businesses. But when we start to look at emerging markets as well, we might be thinking about how do we ensure the democratization of education? How do we reach parts of the communities that maybe didn't have access before, and how do we start to level the playing field there? And that's something that can happen in nearly any economy. Uh, then we start to look at the opportunities around Gen AI. So we start to think about, well, what about personalization, hyper personalization of things? How do we achieve more realistic simulations, for example? So any of these could be a purpose, could be a thing that a business wants to do in terms of their strategy or their outcomes. And then having decided on a purpose, then you can leverage the best available technology to meet that purpose.
Ash,
For,
can I just jump in real quick? So first we set the tech off to the side, we look at the business
yep,
problem, and then we can start to look at maybe how might we approach this,
yes,
and then start to look at tech solutions. I think for me, the interesting question when it comes to tech stack is, and thinking about how we're in the space of AI is what's different now than all other times before. And I think you
yep,
alluded to it earlier when he said the threshold is it's easier to create something. But can you talk a little bit about that? Tell me a bit about, what is
yeah.
different now about the tech than what we were looking at before.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So first thing is we have access to models. So we have access to just as a consumer, we have access to things like ChatGPT. In most enterprises, they have access to things like the Microsoft AI studio, suite, the studio. There is probably access to Copilot, maybe AWS as an environment. We have access publicly, of course, to things like Claude as well. So there is a an access difference. Because there's an access difference, people can now go and make their own GPTs, their own models. We can start to play with this stuff in a way that was never really that possible before. When it comes to if we so that's consumer and enterprise. If we now sort of sharpen the needle a little bit and look specifically at enterprise, the accessibility of large language models, of machine learning models, of various other things in the Microsoft suite, for example. Uh, Most organizations who are Microsoft organizations will have access to these kinds of environments. So you can start to build and you can start to test with you. There is a requirement to have some skill set around that, and the skill sets typically are coding skill sets. So machine learning and Python and things like that. But the barrier is very different, and because that barrier is very different, we can start to build things quickly. The second part of this is the barrier to buying things. So if we think about, you're part of Synthesia, there's a thing that you do for a living, and that is to make realistic synthetic media that looks like people and behaves like people. And there are others in the market, of course. But if we look at this style of software, the barrier to buying those things in is also less than it used to be. But there are still considerations that need to be made. And the considerations in the governance space are slightly prohibitive at this point. And the reason I say that is, although the barrier to buying something is low, what is understood by IT governance around data flows or how how AI works, how data is passed through a third-party system. That's still being teased out. So some organizations are very mature in this space, some organizations are less mature in this space. But these are the kinds of things that start to lead you down, for example, I said earlier, a build or buy kind of consideration. Is it easy for me to build something? Absolutely. Is it easy for me to build something that's going to be a scalable production grade solution globally? No, it really isn't, because I would need to do all of that testing and robustness and make sure it's reliable and stable and all of these things. Whereas when you buy something, you can buy a solution where that's already been taken care of by the vendor, but we also need to think about governance at user side, at client side. We need to think about skills. So I think the landscape has changed in different ways. The barriers are very different. Barriers are to some extent less, but the onus of governance is slightly different.
I think the what this reminds me of is maybe changing formats a little bit about what we're talking about, but it reminds me of decade, a little over a decade ago, when people got cameras in their pockets. Or if we're talking about video, you have cameras in
Yeah.
pockets because it's on your phone, but then you also simultaneously have uh, platforms and channels for people to then produce that video and get it out into the world. And so it's
Mm.
lowering this threshold for who can create video and where they can put it so that it can be seen and then also
Mm.
monetized. I think that's an important thing to mention as well. And maybe the gap in that analogy is there isn't as much data. I mean, maybe somebody's privacy is something to consider, and access and how you're sharing these videos. Maybe if I were to close the loop there, that there's a little bit of crossover there. But I think
Mm.
with generative AI tools, it's lowering the threshold for everyone, not yet for automation, but certainly for individuals doing tasks, which is
Yeah.
why we're still in this place because we still haven't figured out the data and the governance part, especially for enterprise, on if we're going to really make use of these large language models. Is that kind of a fair comparison or summary, or am I missing something there?
Yeah, that is a good comparison, but I think you stimulate me to think of one other thing, and that
Mhm.
is that what we get out of video, what I get out of video from filming with a camera, is reasonably realistic as a representation of what a film crew might get out of their
Mhm.
camera. You know,
Mhm.
the resolution might be different. They might have multi-angle cameras, but to a large degree, I'm still filming a thing, and the thing is there.
Mhm.
When we start to think of generative AI, there's a slightly different consideration, and that is when we think about the accuracy of response in terms of data. So if I ask ChatGPT or Copilot or something that I can access publicly as a consumer, if I ask it for a response, it has been trained on the internet. It has been trained probably at a snapshot in time. It maybe doesn't know the thing that I want it to know.
Mm.
And that's important for a company implementation of anything, because really, if you think about the traditional paradigm of L&D that I was talking about, we know the messages that we're giving to the workforce. We have risk mitigation within that messaging system. We know when things have been accessed, and we can effectively audit that. And that's the content platform data paradigm that we used to have in L&D, and we still have that. But if we were to change that, we now need to consider, well, what's the message that's being given by a virtual agent, whether that's a conversational agent that has text at the front end, or whether it has an avatar at the front end. But what is it actually saying to people? How do we validate
Mm.
that? Where is the data coming from? What's the accuracy of response? And I think, although your example was pretty spot on, it
Oh, thank you.
makes me think about this other world of things, which there's a lot of work going on in this space, but it requires accuracy, it requires testing, it requires data hygiene, and all of these other things that we
And this is, I think this is one of the more I'm probably going to date this episode now that I'm saying it out loud, but I think this has been the most recent development from an enterprise standpoint on how we can, if folks are familiar with RAG, how we can use RAG to
Mm.
essentially reach into information and pick out the right things before we
Yeah.
pull out an output. I think to kind of bring this back more to a general audience, though, what you're talking about is more about controlling the output, which I think has
Yes.
always been the kind of the big problem. Even when ChatGPT first came out, people were like, "Oh, it's hallucinating and it's doing all these things."
Mm.
And then if we take all this data and we make something completely that's automated like a chatbot, we need to be able to understand the full range of what it can do and what kind of answers it's going to output because we see that. So can you talk a little bit about when you encounter this part of the solutions process or the discovery process? What kinds of questions do you ask, or how do you get somebody to um, consider the output or visualize what that could be? Because that's certainly something that I would think you'd want to nail down before you start building anything. So what are some of the considerations there?
Around validating the output of a model.
Yes.
Yeah, so there are two sort of distinct areas here. So one is the software side of it, where you do things like regression testing to figure out, is it actually pulling from the database in the way that we want it to. That's probably a deep dive for another day.
Right.
The other side of it is it if you think about, again, the traditional paradigm, subject matter experts do some learning design, make some e-learning, right? You still have access to all of those experts. They need to, that usually in an organization, they're the people who are accepting the risk of a solution. And there are two reasons to do this. One is to ensure the accuracy of the model or the accuracy of the output, but the other is to ensure acceptance and adoption in the business. And having these SMEs interrogate the model to the nth degree until they are satisfied with the output is the other side. So not the software side, but that's like more the human side of testing. So both of these things need to happen, and ideally they happen in parallel. And I don't think have I seen, probably haven't seen a single model developed that hasn't had multiple iterations of testing, revision, version 2 testing, version 3 testing to hone in that accuracy. And
Mhm.
RAG is one way of doing that. The other way, of course, is fine tuning. And the third way is, we talk about this a lot, but prompting. How do you get the users to have sufficient skill in prompting to be able to ask the right question? And if we think about this process of getting subject matter experts to interrogate a model, they also need to be supported, coached, trained, and learn how to prompt the model and how to ask those questions in a way that it's going to get a meaningful response out of it.
Just when we thought we could have used all of their slide decks and notes and work to make a large language model that we can ask ourselves, it sounds like you definitely still need them. It's an unavoidable part of the process so that we can
Yeah.
verify the accuracy of these models. I think one thing, sorry, go ahead.
It's an interesting point that, do we still need them? We do still need them because we need their intellectual capital. We need their expertise. Do we need their slide sets, their Word documents, their notes? These are artifacts of their expertise, and I don't think we can get away from needing the expertise of people who are experts in their field. Not yet, anyway.
That's a really good point. I'm, I, to I think I want to shift the conversation because I know that back to this idea of AI solutions and the what a successful solution looks like, or a solution that's been built out and is actively being tested. I wanted to go really quickly back to I know that you have an example of a moving into a better I think the example that I saw was in the AI
Mm,
and L&D report, building a better compliance strategy or
yeah.
compliance content strategy
Hmm.
approach. Can you break that down maybe
Yeah.
into its component stages, or can you just break that down into the different stages of where that problem came from and
Yeah.
sort of what are the intermediate stages that went into that? Because I think we're looking for six examples that have gone through, but also I know that probably that work continues as well, and there's other things that
Yeah.
you'd like to continue to do. So tell us a bit about that.
So let's start with the problem statement. The problem statement is something that is almost universal. And it might have been 4 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago, I had a client come to me and they were saying, we have the number escapes me, something like 50,000 people who go through these 10 e-learning modules every single year. Nothing has changed, but they still have to do it because there's a rule, there's an internal policy rule that says we have to do these things. And all of these things are legally mandated. So the kinds of things you would say are health and safety, fraud and bribery, security, the things that every organization has to do. And then you get organizationally specific. So you go, well, this organization has these procedures and policies. This other organization has a very different set of policies relating to their regulatory environment, the things that they have to control for, the risks that they have to mitigate. And usually these things are documents. So PDF documents, Word documents, whatever it happens to be. The learning or training functions in these respective organizations. So this was a problem statement that came from multiple organizations. The training and learning departments were effectively trying to make meaning from these processes and procedures. So we can tell the learners that if you're in this particular scenario, this is what you need to do. These are the documents that you need to understand. You need to have read those. Now, having onboarded to an organization and having read a bunch of documents, let's say I read 100 documents in my first 3 months, and then I go off into the world of work, and I supposedly I remember these things. And with some of these compliance topics, of course, you have this regular period of refresh. This hopefully leads to a highly skilled and highly knowledgeable workforce, but we tend to know that it doesn't, because you click through and then you don't really remember half of this stuff.
And as fast as possible.
Yeah, and this is the problem statement, because the problem statement is A, we are effectively wasting learner time. B, we're not really getting the risk mitigation for the organization in the way that we want. And C, we're not really getting the timely dissemination just in time of information when it is needed. Can we tackle all of these things in one go with a virtual agent? So that was that high level. That was the problem statement that we were trying to look at, and I have looked at this, for a couple of different organizations.
And so, sorry, Ash, just to
Yeah.
restate so that I can make sure that I'm following on for the audience today. But people are given this compliance training. It's pretty much a checkbox
Yep.
exercise, and it's being served up one time
Mhm.
versus when folks might actually use it, need it,
Yeah.
refer. Okay, great.
And then all of the sort of associated costs, opportunity costs, and things like that that go with it, which are, you know, uh,
The company getting sued, or yeah.
well, opportunity costs are slightly different, because that is if you've got your entire workforce going through an hour of e-learning, that's an hour of time that they're not doing productive other things with their time. But if it's not timely, then they're not necessarily adding value in the way that you would expect with that particular module or particular learning intervention. So there are multiple benefits to exploring it a different way.
Mm.
So what could we do in that space? So that was really the question on my mind. What can we do in that space with AI, generative AI, and the tool sets that we have available to us? And the virtual agents idea was kind of obvious. How do we go and do this? So you mentioned RAG earlier. So RAG is retrieval augmented generation. So you are using a large language model to generate a conversational style output, but that conversational style output is it's in text or it can be voice. But that is achieved by the large language model being directed to a source of data, it could be your procedural database, it could be something that is your company data, it could be your bank of compliance legislation, whatever it happens to be. And there are a few examples of this out in the literature. But the idea is that you direct your large language model to a source of information, and it gives you, therefore, a realistic answer based on the information that's in that database. Now, there are a couple of requirements there. So, one requirement is that you have data, you know what your procedures and policies and what the regulatory environment is, and you have a good understanding of what you actually want people to know. That's the stuff, that's the information that needs to be in that database. And then your build effectively would be directing your large language model to dip into that database and then give a response. So that's something that is high level. That's a build that doesn't have a massive barrier to entry. It's a fairly obvious build, and there are lots of companies doing this kind of thing. We're
I have a question for you. So I think I'm following along on the build. I think something that you said that a virtual agent seemed obvious. And I think that's,
Yes,
no, I think because you're the expert, it
to
seemed
me.
obvious to you. But please tell me,
Mm.
why did it seem obvious to you at the time versus maybe a lower tech solution or something that was more trigger or event based, as opposed to having a virtual agent? Why did that seem obvious to you?
What do you mean by trigger or event-based system?
Meaning, so much time has passed, maybe we can come up with a strategy where we deliver these in shorter sequences, or we can use some form of assessment to assess, knowledge retention, or maybe it's
Mm,
triggered where, hey, you're about to, let's say you have a travel policy. Hey, you're about to take a trip. Here, don't forget XYZ. Did you get it?
mm.
And I hate quizzes and knowledge tests, but that's how people do things. So something that's trigger or event based, that's how that's my example. So why would those not work versus you said a virtual agent seemed obvious to you?
Yes. So a virtual agent is also trigger or event-based because you're asking it when you need something, you're asking a repository of data, what is the answer? And you have, I think what you're referencing is these, the travel systems where you book a hotel or you book a flight, and then it says, have you completed your travel risk assessments or something like that. Um,
Yes.
that's that's also trigger or event based in the same way, and I think a lot of those SaaS systems also have virtual agents, which are integrated into those platforms now. So it's something that seemed to me obvious because what ideally you want is either a workplace trigger. So if I have a building management system that tells me I'm replacing light bulbs today, for example, I know I have this light bulb in this particular room to go and visit. I could get a map and I could get a how to replace a light bulb. Very high level example. I could get that based on a system trigger that knows that that's in my workflow for today. With
Mm-hmm.
knowledge workers, we tend not to have that granularity over our workflow. So, what is the trigger that we could consider? The trigger that we could consider is I'm going to do a thing. I'm going to go and search on YouTube, on Google, on company systems, on wherever the information is. I'm going to search for it because as a knowledge worker, the trigger is me requesting the information, me searching for the information. And if we think about that as a trigger, then it would be great if we could go to a single agent that would give us a response. So that's hopefully
Yeah,
that
yeah.
answers the
No,
question.
no, I think that perfectly explains it. I, one of the problems that I know exists in that has existed since the beginning of time in learning and development is this idea of pushing resources. You push
Mm,
resources on people who say, I don't need this right now, and so therefore I'm not motivated to take it, or I'm just
mm,
going to click through as fast as I can, versus, hey, I ran into this obstacle. Where do
yeah,
I find a solution? And right now, if you don't work at the places that you've worked at, they probably go to YouTube because somebody has broken down that workflow or that process for them.
yeah.
So I think that's a great answer.
I mean, it fits into the dynamic as well. We used to talk about this with the LMSs and LXPs, this kind of dynamic of push, pull, and share, right?
Yeah.
So we want social learning, but we also want to be able to push particular learning interventions because they are mandatory. We also want people to pull for the sake of their growth or development. So I think it also fits in broadly into that scope as well.
Interesting. And I think where this naturally takes me to thinking about this idea of and I read in that report it's again this idea of conversational agents where hey it's supposed to mimic the idea that I'm going to ask an expert or a guide or
Mm,
someone to help me complete my task. What happens when we put a face on that? And so I'm curious. I know that digital twins and and personal avatars, that two of the same thing depending on who you're speaking to. Um, that's an area that you've been following, and obviously we've
mm.
had conversations about that. But I'm curious, what is the I think generative AI video. If we talk about it now and this idea of creating of having a personal avatar or using even a stock avatar, someone who is expressive who can explain and talk through information. I think there's obvious applications to how we currently do things in L&D, which you were talking about content development. But I'm wondering, what's the role of generative AI video for in the next couple of years, or what
Mm.
are the solutions that you're trying to build, or what's the opportunity that you see?
So you've touched on the kind of lower hanging fruit. Let's just go through that in a little detail. So the first one is if we have access to accurate, contextually relevant virtual agents. So this is either RAG or fine-tuned or with prompt engineering. Then the idea of enriching that experience in a way that is potentially personal, in a way that is potentially almost human, but
Mhm.
there is a place for that with synthetic humans, with avatars, with that kind of front end experience, because that's the face that you would talk with. That does require a couple of additional bits, though, I think, because currently with large language models, ChatGPT, Copilot, etc., we do type. We do also use audio. So, yeah, certainly on the phone experience, yeah, on the mobile version of most of these models, you can talk to it and it'll give you a conversational response in audio. So the user experience is evolving. And when we get to that point where we can put a face on it, we also potentially have a point where we are then able to access cameras. And if I'm talking to an agent and it is giving me a voice response, that is ever so slightly different to what we're doing right now, which is we're looking at each other, we're
Mhm.
reading cues. I can see that you're nodding, so I know that you're understanding what I'm saying. If a virtual agent can do that, then we get a much we get a higher level of user experience in that because we're getting this idea of feedback, and feedback is something that's important in learning generally. But that level of feedback we can't currently do. So
Mhm.
the idea of media enrichment in the user experience when it comes to virtual agents, I think, is one of the exciting areas. The idea of media enrichment when it comes to the standard, the paradigm of learning and development that I was talking about, where we're reformatting content, applying design principles to it, etc. I think that is definitely there, and it lowers the marginal cost of, of making one video. You don't have to go and film things. You don't have to set up a studio, lighting, and all this stuff. But I think if we're making video, but we're making video more quickly, but we're still just putting it in a storyline course or a rise course or something, then we've got kind of two problems. One is we're not really changing anything. So we're going to get, although we have a peak of interest at the moment because there's novelty involved, I think over time that's not going to sustain. The second thing is when we can make things more quickly with a lower cost, we're going to have this proliferation of a deluge of videos. So now instead of one video that was very targeted and had exactly that information that I want, now we have 1,000 videos that I have to sift through, and you start to get to this idea of content chaos and the Netflix problem where I spend more time looking for things than I do watching things. So we've got both opportunities and risks that we need to counter. Of course, we could enrich, but we need to enrich with a purpose and not just flood the market with information. So the first thing was the virtual agents and the face. The second thing is the traditional L&D paradigm and media enrichment on that.
Interesting. So I guess what needs to change in order for us to, because I think the experience of a virtual agent and kind of that using having avatars be a face for information, I think that will become table stakes for
Mm-hmm.
vendors and platforms who
Yeah.
want to deliver on these solutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm curious about is a lot of folks who are on L&D teams, unless they find a way to procure these tools, are still going to be focusing on optimization, process,
Yeah.
developing or changing their development process. What needs to change for those folks who are in what I think is largely still the context for the majority of L&D teams?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and I'm smiling a little bit because there's almost no end to the answer to this, right? What needs to change?
Sorry,
So
that
if
was
you
a bit
think
of a
about
traffic. Yeah.
well, if you think about, I'll give you a couple of examples of where my thought processes go. So if you take a team, let's not even say L&D, it's just a team that's in some part of the business, and they are incentivized to maximize throughput. So all of their KPIs are how many items did you produce? Let's call it a factory, right? How many items did you produce? That's how we're going to measure success in your department. And you say, right, last year I produced 100 items. Next year, I have some fancy tools. We can call them generative AI. Let's just call them fancy tools. And next year, I can produce 1,000 of these items. Round of applause everywhere because the department itself was incentivized on volume. So when you say what needs to change, I could go in a fairly granular way through every little thing that needs to change, but it's almost systemic in L&D to think about batch throughput, think about effectively content factories, and to think about incentivization based on volume. All of these things somehow need to change, and we need to think about what's the meaning of the message. How are we actually reaching the person with something that's a meaningful experience? And is that meaningful experience something that is effectively controlled by the L&D department? Or does the locus change towards, as I said, democratization of education, and the learner is now in the driving seat and being able to find the thing that they need? All of
Yes.
these things are very different ways to think about the same problem.
I think that what this reminds me of is an event that you and I recently attended where one of the speakers was Stuart Brooks,
Yeah.
who was at Lloyd's for a while, who I think stared this problem straight in the face, meaning he
Mm,
was just like, the reason I was able to succeed at Lloyd's with my L&D function was thinking about L&D as a business with customers and products and
mm,
services and looking at shelf life and development times and optimizing for those. And it sounded like he kind of accepted the situation, was able to guarantee that he was um, delivering on the metrics that the business incentivized and
yeah.
measured his team on. And once he was able to do that to an extent, then he was able to build trust and partnership and look at other ways, other services and experiences that his team could deliver on to then solve business problems. But
Yeah.
it wasn't until he kind of controlled the measurement that he was facing, that he was able to then kind of get to that next stage of where every L&D or every L&D team wants to get to, which is having more of a consulting partnership as opposed
Yeah.
to just delivering on courses and resources.
And do you think that's happening at the moment? Because I mean, I would reflect and say that because of the disruption with generative AI, there's a lot of departments, not only L&D, but they're a little bit scrambling to say, well, what's our place in the new world? How do we justify the thing that we're doing, and how do we change what it is that we're doing? And
Yeah.
we're still in that kind of cycle at the moment. So, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I love this question. I think that in the person that this makes me think of is Robin DeFelice, who is part of an American association here called HED, and she has this.
Mm,
While folks in London are doing the AI and L&D survey, she is working has been working on, can we benchmark the development time of instructional products? And
mm,
so essentially, how does it take to create a unit? How long does it take to create a unit of microlearning, of interactive e-learning? And
okay.
she just suggests that this is a starting place, just a survey based off of 600 folks. But why I bring this up is because a lot of teams that I end up working with through Synthesia and helping develop solutions is they themselves don't have these benchmarks to then take back to the business to start the conversation of, am I being incentivized or measured on the right things or at all? Rather, it's just how many requests got sent in and how many did I fulfill, which
Mm,
is I guess gets at the same metric, but it's not very nuanced. And
yeah.
so that is always the first place that I try and start with folks is, hey, can we look at the last three projects, look at the design cycle, see how
Mm,
long it took you to develop those things. So that's my opinion is you have to know where to start so that you have something to measure, so then that you can make the case that you're meeting the requirements, so that you can then
mm,
build trust to then build
yeah.
and so on and so on. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. A lot of teams just don't know where they are at the moment.
Yeah. I think that, so of the two ideas that I tabled, I think
Sure.
that what you just said is absolutely paramount for one of those ideas, and that is where we are changing our content development processes or workflows. If we take this other idea of we have effectively corporate wide virtual agents that have access to the entirety of a data corpus that an organization has, and you can dip in and get a very realistic and contextual answer with an avatar at the front end, something that's almost a human experience. it's almost like having a mentor or a coach or a guiding other.
Yeah.
Uh, that that's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen next month. That requires work, right?
Yes.
But that's that's a very different paradigm for learning because that's not a content first proposition. So I would say in that proposition, we probably don't need to benchmark how long a development cycle is.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah, I think going back to tying it to something that you said earlier, this idea of um, using avatars to build experiences.
Mm,
I'm what my mission is to make e-learning less boring. And so I would actually fold the design of avatars in different roles into the new development. Well, sorry, I had a couple of thoughts. One of them of which is if you're going to use these AI tools to develop content, it's going to take you a shorter amount of time. What are
yeah.
you then using that time for? Are you using it for better analysis? Are you
Mm,
using it for uh, more time with stakeholders and getting input? Is it more time on the learning experience? And I hope that it gets tied back to the opportunity that you said, which is how do we develop better, more richer, more engaging experiences with generative AI video. So
mm.
that's my response to that. Ash, I have we're going to end here with something that's a little bit new. I'm going to put you on the spot. Just
Okay.
for the folks before we send ourselves away. I've got three questions for you. These are related, these could be related to what we were talking about today, but I'm here to keep you on your toes. Just
Okay.
respond with as much or as little as you feel comfortable. But these three questions. First one, the rapid fire questions. What tool right now can you not live without?
Tool in a technology sense.
Uh, However you'd like to answer that question.
Tool I cannot live without. This is going to be a very non-technical question, but tool I cannot live without is a good cooking knife. So tool is something that we use to interact with our environment, and one thing I do is a lot is cooking. That
Okay.
is a sharp, good, sturdy cooking knife is absolutely the tool I need.
Okay, a good sturdy cooking knife. Next, so here's the second one coming at you quick. Something you have a strong hunch about, but not yet the data to prove.
Uh, Something I have a strong hunch about. So I have a hunch about how this AI thing is panning out in L&D. And I think I don't have the data to prove it, but I think the disruption to this industry around the content side of the business is going to be something that we can't yet foresee. I think that's going to be 3, 5 years time from now. The idea of developing content that is one size fits all and putting that on an LMS is going to be something we look back on and just go think, why did we ever do that?
Okay, fair enough. And then the last question coming to you. What tasks in your life or your work would your digital twin take over?
If I could, this would be amazing, right? If I could have a digital twin that could play what I can play and I could double up. And to some degree, you can do that with multi-tracking in a studio, right? But if I could double up and jam with a digital twin of myself playing guitar, that would be absolutely awesome.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I would be here for that vinyl pressing, that recording, whatever comes out of it. I really appreciate you, Ash. Ash, is there how if folks want to get in touch with you, what's the best place to get in touch and how can they make use of that fantastic brain of yours?
Yeah, so get in touch on LinkedIn. I'd like to do learning tech strategy primarily. So I don't necessarily differentiate between AI or digital twin, blockchain, ecosystems, platforms. It's all technology that we have available to us to make our businesses or lives better, more effective, and make that impact. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. We can have a chat about any kind of strategy you want.
Got it. And any other resources you want to shout out today or links that folks can go to get in touch with you?
So I have a website, methodology.com. It's brand new, so it's not particularly detailed, but have a look and message me on that as well.
Sounds good. We'll make sure those end up in the show notes. But Ash, thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful to talk to you. Um,
Likewise.